Book 10, The Jesuits, 1540 to 1860. Introduction. Birth of Ignatius de Loyola, his youth and disappointments, conversion, pilgrimage to Montserrat, exercises, opposition encountered in France and Portugal, his companions, journey to the Holy Land, travels and vicissitudes, persecuted by the Inquisition. He organizes his congregation in Montmartre, Paris, extensive propagation of the Company of Jesus. It is certain that no institution which has arisen from the bosom of the Church of Rome has furnished matter for more discussion than the Company of Jesus, and that no religious corporation has been more vehemently assailed by great and small together, since it may be said that its persecutions commenced with its life, and that during more than 350 years, through which it has now existed, it has continuously extended and aggrandized itself and become a formidable power in the face of curses. Banishments and spoliations of its members in masses, papal anathemas, the violent measures of governments, and the fury of mobs have failed everywhere to prevent this remarkable society from taking root in the soil and stretching its influence to the furthest parts of the world. In Chile, as in Rome, and in China, as in Paraguay, and in Moscow, the Jesuits have penetrated, have been expelled, and have made their way back.
Se è cacciati e tornar d'ogni parte, meaning, if they were driven out, they would return from everywhere.
Meantime, the term Jesuit and Jesuitism have been associated in all common parlance with notions of hypocrisy, dissimulation, and prevarication without limits, and of an ambition restrained by no scruples regarding the means it employs. The mystery surrounding the operations of the society has contributed immensely to increase its influence by prepossessing the imagination of the world in its favor. The books written for and against it have been so numerous and voluminous that in seeking for materials for its history, we have only been embarrassed by their abundance. The interest of the subject is still quite fresh, and it ought to be studied not in an historical epitome, but in thick volumes, in which would be found much diversified and entertaining matter, as well as many interesting and important lessons. The Company of Jesus owed its origin to the age of the Renaissance, when the Church of Rome was assailed on all sides, and with all manner of weapons, in its desperate resistance to the revived principles of Greek and Roman civilization, and to the Protestant and schismatic doctrines which removed from its jurisdiction nearly all the north of Europe. The object of the institution was to raise an auxiliary army for this church, and to complete the work of the Inquisition by milder but more artful expedients. The Inquisition has now disappeared from the world, but the Company of Jesus has remained, and gives no signs of an impending disappearance. The Inquisition burned those who forsook the Catholic faith. The Jesuits exerted themselves to retain within the limits of the faith, and to attach to the Church by the securest ties all those whose disaffection could have injured it. Great men were produced by the Company of Jesus in all spheres of activity: legislators, historians, poets, orators, philosophers, captains, and statesmen, whose names are for the most part well known, and whom it would be tedious here to enumerate. Nevertheless, in spite of all their brilliant qualities, they have always failed to make themselves popular, or to overcome the widespread instinct which suggests a horror of the character of the Jesuit. Has this resulted from the natural qualities of the members of the Company of Jesus, or from the genius of the institution itself? We trust the reader will be enabled to answer the question when he reaches the end of this brief and conscientious epitome. Let us first take a rapid view of the origin of the persecutions of this society. The Jesuits acknowledge the bad reputation under which it labors, and have accordingly written numerous defenses and apologies. For example, Father Bartoli says in vindication of the history of the order, quote, "Not only among heretics, but among Catholics, there are many found who, by word of mouth and by writing, have endeavored to bring upon it the hatred and contempt of the world, representing it as unquiet, dangerous, ambitious, domineering, and degenerate." Unquote. We are neither apologists nor furious adversaries, but we shall endeavor to sketch the history of the persecutions of this company with unswerving impartiality. Ignatius de Loyola was born towards the end of the 15th century of a noble Spanish family and was, during his youth, a page to Ferdinand the Catholic. Having afterwards turned soldier, he was severely wounded at Pamplona, which he ineffectually defended against the French. He retired from his profession with a foot permanently lamed and the consciousness of having lingered on the brink of the grave. After returning to his father's home, he gave himself up, during his convalescence, to religious meditations, and he retained such a profound impression of his disaster and of a disappointment in matrimony which had been the result of it, that he took up the pilgrim's staff and made his way to Montserrat in Catalonia, where he definitively abandoned the military profession, made a general confession, and took a vow of chastity, consecrating his body and soul to the service of the Catholic Church and to its deliverance from the enemies it was beset with. His first work was the Exercises, to which his name is attached, and of which the object is to prepare souls assailed by doubt or indifference for the act of consecrating themselves to God by renouncing not only their worldly possessions, but even their natural affections, the world, and all that emanates from it. On these exercises were founded the great doctrine of the Company of Jesus, but the work no sooner began to get known than a tremendous storm was raised against it in the very midst of the Catholic Church, and the Sorbonne condemned it in 1535 as suspicious and contrary to Catholic doctrine. A like fortune befell it in Portugal, where the prelates declared it was fit for nothing but to turn the world mad. Within 10 years, however, the Exercises, thanks to Francis de Borgia, who had made strong representations in their favor, received the formal sanction of Paul III, the author of the famous bull that revived the Inquisition in Italy. And Ignatius was thus encouraged to pursue throughout his life the task of revising and perfecting this composition. Previously to establishing his company, Ignatius visited the Holy Land, and he returned by way of Alcala, where he was arrested and confined 40 in odd days in consequence of the disappearance of some ladies of quality. He was only released when they came forward and declared that he had spontaneously quitted their houses to perform some pilgrimage or other. He was acquitted on the 1st of June, 1537, but commanded at the same time to abandon his habit and to dress like other students, and prohibited from publicly dealing in theology, under pain of excommunication and banishment from the realm. He quitted Alcala for Salamanca, and Salamanca for Paris, where he became acquainted with LAYNEZ, Francis Xavier, and others, who became intimately attached to him. Even in Salamanca, the police had followed his footsteps, and he had been 3 days confined in a monastery, and then passed 3 weeks in a dungeon, where he was loaded with chains. After his sojourn at Paris, he went on, begging his way, to Flanders, and thence to England. He returned to Paris, the Inquisition pursuing him, and having there rejoined some of his friends, began to take measures for the foundation of his contemplated religious order. The Roman cardinals, however, opposed the plan of his Company of Jesus, and many difficulties had to be overcome before the Pope would consent to its establishment. But before it acquired a legal standing, Ignatius had already organized this company at the Church of Our Lady in Montmartre of Paris, where it comprised 1 Frenchman, Peter Lefebvre, and 5 Spaniards named Simon Rodriguez, Nicolas Borbidilla, Alfonso Salmeron, James Laynez, and Francis Xavier. Such was the origin of the celebrated Company of Jesus, which, within a short time, as we shall see, overspread the world and began to receive prodigious augmentations in spite of all kinds of persecutions and expulsions. Chapter 1. The Rule of the Jesuits. Idea of St. Ignatius. LAYNEZ, his successor. Prerogatives of the general. Duties of his subordinates. Passive obedience. Relations between the Jesuits and the Pope. Habit of the Jesuits. Their constitutions. Diversities among the members. Mysteries environing their society. The constitutions of the Company of Jesus are not so easily stated as might be supposed. Their government is monarchical, as it depends solely on the will of their general, although the latter is subordinate to the Pope. St. Ignatius, however, alleged that his company formed a mixed monarchy, inasmuch as he reserved to the congregation or general assembly of the professed brethren the right of electing the general of the order, partaking with him the legislative power, and deposing the general in certain cases. Nevertheless, just as happens in the majority of so-called mixed or constitutional monarchies, this participation in power of the society is completely illusory, because the general alone has power to convoke its assemblies, and the professed brethren who take part in them are merely his creatures, inasmuch as he grants offices and distributes employments like a king in his dominions. The sovereignty of the society was, therefore, a fiction, and LAYNEZ, who succeeded Ignatius in his command, got it settled, after the latter's death, that the general alone had a right to establish new rules. Let us see now what are the prerogatives of this general. He administers the society and exercises a jurisdiction over all the members. From him emanates all the authority of the provincials and other superiors, and he reserves to himself the faculty of distributing to each, or withdrawing from him, such authority as he finds necessary. He has to watch over the observance of the institutions, but from this charge he is authorized to release himself. No member can, without permission of the general, accept any dignity outside the society, and he who so accepts one, even if it be among the highest in the church or the state, remains forever subject to the rules of the company, and bound to listen to the counsels of the general. The general is empowered to make rules, and to issue ordinances and declarations respecting the constitution of the company, and the bulls of 1540, 1543, and 1571, authorize him to make all such particular constitutions as he may think necessary for the good of the society. These he may also modify, alter, or abolish when he thinks proper. In all things that pertain to the interests of the society, the general can command all the members without exception in virtue of the principle of passive obedience, and even if he has transferred a part of his powers to any of his subordinates, he can still annul what they do, or modify it as he judges opportune, without exempting his inferiors, by this self-contradiction, from the submission they owe him as the representative of Jesus Christ. He has full powers to make himself all kinds of contracts for the society. Malversation in its financial affairs is considered as furnishing a case for the deposition of the general, but he has carte blanche to give alms for the greater glory of God. He must discuss important affairs with his assessors, but the latter have no voice or vote on them. He can expel from the society whomever he pleases, and admit members and distribute degrees and offices at discretion, and he can command all members of the society in the name of Jesus Christ and in virtue of the obedience they owe to him under pain of incurring mortal sin. He can institute missions in all parts of the world, remove the missionaries, and, in many cases, cancel their appointments, sending them wherever he chooses, and even among infidels and savages. He alone has power to commute the bequests made to the society. The correction and revision of the books of the company fall within his attributes. He can distribute, personally or by his delegates, the favors granted by the Pope to the society. He can dispense indulgences to the seminarists and the congregations annexed to that of Rome, and to the congregations of men and women directed by the society in all places and countries, and in virtue of the supreme authority which he exercises over the order, he can make its adepts and protectors participate in its good works, prayers, and suffrages. He must know all that lies upon the conscience of his subordinates, the upper ones especially. Whatever he has granted or enacted must be fulfilled so long as his successor does not annul it. The provincials have to give him an account of the state of their provinces every month, and this must be done at the same time by the consultors, a kind of comptrollers who have an understanding directly with the general. All the superiors have to send the general every year 2 rolls or catalogues, one containing the names of all the brethren of their several colleges, with specifications of their age, country, standing in the society, past employments and studies, degrees in the universities, and so forth. The other describing the character and capacities of each, with an estimate of his experience, intelligence, and talents, and a verdict as to the employments for which he appears most fitting. The concentration of all these prerogatives in the general converts the company into a passive instrument of his will. When things are to be written that require secrecy, it is prescribed that this should be done in a form which only the person addressed may be able to decipher, and it is the general who furnishes him the key of the system. With respect to the papal authority, the Jesuits are commanded by the bulls of Paul III in the years 1540 and 1543 to execute all orders of the Pope referring to the salvation of souls and the propagation of the faith, even in the lands of the Turks and the heathens. But the authority of the popes in this point has since been restricted to the missions in foreign countries, the general reserving to himself the power of recalling those missionaries whom the Pope sends out without determining the time for which their appointment is to last. The Jesuits cannot appeal to the Pope from the orders of their general, except only when the Pope grants them a special permission. Nevertheless, the authority of their general suffices to release them from their vows, and in things which both the Pope and the general can do, they are admonished to make their first applications to the latter. The general of the Jesuits is, in this manner, a real sovereign, whose dominions interpenetrate those of princes. Nevertheless, he exhibits no external force, because it is according to their rules, as we shall see, to conform themselves, as far as possible, and even in their dress, to the usages and customs of every country, with a view to avoid collisions with them and consequent persecutions. On this subject, we find the following significant expressions in Bartoli's History of the Company of Jesus. Quote, "The new heretics having, in the north of Europe, provoked an extreme antipathy of religious habit, it was considered prudent that the members of the company should wear such dresses as might not hinder them from living familiarly with those whom they had to convert. On this ground, our missionaries in China and India wear the dress of mandarins and Brahmins, which is there the most respectable, and so in heretical countries we transform them into merchants, physicians, artisans, and even menials, in order that they may discharge their missions without provoking distrust." Unquote. As far as regards the convenience of the disguises here mentioned, we may add that we doubt not Father Bartoli is quite in the right, and we acknowledge it the more readily from having seen, in our own time, the results obtained by Jesuits who have assumed the appearance, now of popular militiamen, now of royal mercenaries, and have thus served the same cause in many provinces, and by conduct as various as their exteriors. But it is certain that this subordination of the means to the end, though it has facilitated the aggrandizement of the company, has, at the same time, compromised their reputation, and contributed not a little to the distrust they have everywhere inspired, and the persecutions they have had to undergo. Nevertheless, it may be confidently affirmed that of all the religious bodies which have sprung from the womb of the Catholic Church, the Company of Jesus is, next to the Templars, that which has succeeded most perfectly in founding a state within a state, or within states. The constitutions speak of 4 classes of members: the professed brethren, who take 3 or sometimes 4 vows, the coadjutors, the students, and the novices. There is, however, a fifth class, as we see by the first chapter of the Examen, consisting of persons admitted to the solemn profession of the 3 vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. There are also persons living under obedience to the general, but enjoying immunities, privileges, and faculties which seemingly exempt them from his authority, and over those Paul III declares that the general is to retain a plenary jurisdiction. Who are these persons? Are they the unknown Jesuits who live with their families and who wear no cassock? Quote, Jesuits of the short cowl, unquote, as the people have for 3 centuries called them? Are they affiliated men and women, forming around the company a species of invisible circle, a circle of unknown ears and arms, which act and hear on their account, and facilitate their Catholic operations by secret means, which can be guessed at only by the results? If we could answer these questions in the affirmative, the whole mystery of the subject would disappear. But we learn, by the history of the Jesuits and their institutions, that the existence of this class of brethren would be quite consistent with the character and principles of the company, and must almost be imagined indispensable to its development as a link which would connect it with the worldly society in the midst of which it must live and operate. Chapter 2. Historical Considerations on the Earliest Jesuits. Foundation of the Politico-Religious Missions. Privileges of the Company of Jesus. Authority of the Popes. Gregory XIV. His bull sanctioning the institution of the Company. Emancipation of the Jesuits from the civil power. Creation of the Judge Conservators. One of the severest magistrates who, during the past century, contributed to the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain, says, in speaking of St. Ignatius, quote, the founder of the Company of the Jesuits was an enthusiastic fanatic, persuaded and convinced that one can preach and teach religion without having learnt it. He wanted to convert Jews, Greeks, and infidels of all nations without knowing any language but his own, and thought himself in no need of that labor to which the greatest luminaries of the Church have submitted before exercising a ministry which requires knowledge and capacity. This was the origin of his imprisonments and vexations in Alcacia, Salmanica, and Paris before he had founded his order and studied theology. But we must do him the justice to say that, though the study of pious books gave him inexact notions, which were but tardily corrected, they yet did not impair the rectitude of his heart, which was governed by no other motive than the salvation of souls. His aims were pure and disinterested. He was guided in them by the ideas at that time prevalent on the absolute authority of the Pope, but he did not deduce from them the same horrible consequences as later reasoners. LAYNEZ, the successor of Ignatius, was a monk and a courtier, by intrigue a general, and in principles a semi-Pelagian. Acquavia belonged to a noble Neapolitan household, and those two having been alike brought up in the pomps and grandeurs of the Roman court, but had little disposition towards the simplicity and generosity of the character of Ignatius. These generals formed and settled the plan of the temporal power of the company by the model of the Church of Rome, creating within that church another, which was soon to be a source of jealousy and disquietude to it. They saw before them an empire half Catholic and half political, a court with its courtiers and its affairs, and the union of the two powers in one, whom they considered the monarch of the world, exercising the spiritual power by himself and by the priests, to whom he delegated a part of it, and the temporal power by laymen, who serve as a support to him, and whose authority he reserves to himself the right of suppressing, deposing sovereigns, anointing lords, and releasing from their allegiance the vassals of those who refuse to submit to him. On the model of this temporal power of the Church of Rome, LAYNEZ and Acquavia founded the institution of the company, believing it their duty to augment its authority, spiritual and temporal, its consideration, its credit and its wealth. St. Francis of Borgia, who succeeded to the generalship in 1569, or about 13 years after the death of Ignatius, observed these tendencies and censured the ambition, pride, and love of riches which in his time characterized the company, and which he dreaded the fatal consequences, as we see by a letter directed to the Jesuits of Guyenne, which was printed at Ypres in 1611. Unquote. In like manner, the Spanish historian Marina, who may be considered as one of the lights of the company, which he joined in 1554, while Ignatius was general and lived in under 5 of his successors, says in the book entitled The Defects of Society, Chapter 3, that St. Ignatius and the other early generals did not govern as despotically as Aquaviva, and that it was not surprising that minds should have been alienated by the latter's arbitrary rule. And in chapter 19, he assures us that the laws, and still more the rules, of the company were frequently changed, so that the corporation acquired a character quite repugnant to the plan of the founder. The natural consequences of that principle of passive obedience, which Ignatius established and exalted as one of the first, or the very first, obligation of his society, could not have failed to realize themselves. LAYNEZ and Aquaviva employed, solely for their own aggrandizement, the instrument which Ignatius had fashioned, though at the same time aggrandizing the institution, of which they were the life and soul. Aquaviva was more hasty than circumstances rendered advisable, and presently found himself at odds with the Spanish Inquisition. Nevertheless, he obtained permission from Gregory XIII to trade in the Indies under pretext of serving the interest of the mission, and received an exclusive privilege of sending missionaries to Japan. It was he who founded the politico-religious missions of Paraguay, which helped much to nourish the company's ideas of temporal aggrandizement. The company arose in an age of corruption, fanaticism, and barbarism, as is proved by those disastrous religious wars and those ruthless proceedings of the Inquisition, which devastated Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries. The early Jesuits were zealous and fanatical defenders of the supremacy of the Roman Catholic religion. Their zeal could not prevent one half of Europe from declaring against the papacy, but it was not the less a powerful engine of defense against the encroachments of Protestantism. It is worthy of remark that the constitutions of the Jesuits do not resemble those of any order founded before theirs, and that they may be summed up in the following formula. Quote, to subject the most outrageous fanaticism to a system and to rules of conduct, and hold under a severe curb its otherwise uncertain extravagances for the service of one great power, at the same time religious and political. Unquote. The first thing we observe in their constitutions is that they recognize no other sovereign and absolute power than that of the Pope, as well in temporals as in spirituals, and the second, the absolute power that is granted to their general for the defense and promotion of their spiritual and temporal interests. In the bull of 1540, in which the institution of the company is authorized, the founder and his associates declare that they will obey the Pope alone, and obey him without reserve. In the constitutions we find explained what is meant by this obedience, namely, that he must be obeyed as if he were Jesus Christ, he who obeys divesting himself of every thought of his own, and being inwardly persuaded that whatever is commanded him is just. On this point, not only do all the constitutions agree, but all the writers of the Company of Jesus. Quote, a king, unquote, says Salmeron, for instance, quote, in receiving baptism and renouncing Satan, engages tacitly not to misuse his power against the Church, and it is understood that he consents to be dethroned in the event of his doing otherwise. It is a divine law that Christians cannot elect a king who is not a Christian. How can the spiritual king be less in the Church
than he was in the synagogue, and not be able to make a king as suits him and as he pleases. The power which the priests had but figuratively in the Old Testament, they have much more under the New Testament dispensation, both over the person of the king and his property. The Bishop of Rome, the successor of St. Peter, can, for the good of his flock, take away with a word the life of the body. He can make war upon heretics and schismatics and exterminate them, employing for this purpose the Catholic princes, because Jesus Christ, in sending him to feed his sheep, has authorized him to cast out and kill the wolves if they injure that flock. And what is more, if the leader of the flock harms them, either through a contagious disease or by butting them with his horns, the shepherd may depose him from his command and headship in the flock. In temporal things, God has given to St. Peter and his successors only an indirect dominion over all the empires and kingdoms of the world, in virtue of which he may, if the interest of the church require it, alter and transfer them from one hand to another." Unquote. Quote, "We maintain," says Jesuit Bellarmine, "that the Pope has power to depose of all the temporal goods of all Christians. The spiritual power does not intermeddle with temporal things, provided they do not prejudice the spiritual or inevitably tend to prejudice them. If this happens, the spiritual power can and ought to restrain the temporal by every means it thinks necessary. The Pope, consequently, can alter empires, take away the crown from one man, and give it to another, as being a sovereign, spiritual prince if he thinks it necessary to the salvation of souls. If the Christians did not depose Nero and Diocletian, Julian the Apostate, or Valens the Arian, it was for want of power, and not because their right was deficient. And in the name of the Pope, Bellarmine adds, quote, "If thy obedience to thy king concerns thy salvation, then I am superior to thy king, even in temporal things. You are the sheep, and the kings the bell rams. While they are such, I permit them to guide and govern you, but if they become wolves, ought I to consent to their guiding the sheep of the Lord? You must not acknowledge, therefore, as a king, anyone who seeks to make you deviate from the right path, nor whom I shall cast out of the society of the righteous and deprive of his kingdom, but to whosoever will legitimately replace him, you must yield the civic obedience due to a king." Unquote. According to the Jesuit Molina, quote, "The spiritual power of the Pope carries with it the most ample temporal power and jurisdiction over princes and over all faithful of the Church, so that, if the object of eternal life require it, the Pope can depose kings and deprive them of their kingdoms, and suppress their laws and edicts, not alone by censures, but by constraining them in external penalties and by force of arms, employing for this purpose the other princes who are subject to his authority, since to this end it is that the sovereign pontiff unites in his person the temporal and spiritual power. Jesus Christ would not have provided the necessities of his church if he had not made all temporal princes vassals of the Pope, conferring on him plenary authority to guide and constrain them at his discretion to the measures he believes necessary for supernatural ends. The Pope can depose kings if the preservation of the faith, the Church, or the spiritual interests of the community require it. If a prince becomes a heretic or schismatic, the Pope may use against him his temporal power, deposing and ordering him to be thrown out of his kingdom. Furthermore, if Christian kings make war for any temporal causes whatsoever, and from this any detriment accrues to the Church, the Pope may adjust the quarrel, even in their despite, and they will be bound to accept his verdict. And if he abstains from doing this, it is not because he has no right to, but because he fears that they may rise against the pontifical chair, or that other disastrous consequences may ensue. We shall prove, he adds in Book 3, that the Pope does not exceed his rights when he constrains kings by temporal penalties and by depriving them of their realms, and what is more, that this power is more necessary to the Church with respect to kings than their subjects. It is the part of the shepherd not only to punish the sheep that stray, but, in defense of the sheep, to cast out the wolves, that they may not drag them from the fold. Wherefore the Pope, as sovereign pastor, may deprive princes of their dominions, and thence expel them, that they may not harm their subjects. He may release the latter from their oath of allegiance and annul it. He may use for this purpose the arms of other faithful princes, so that the secular is always subjected to the spiritual. It is lawful for a private man to slay a tyrant as a matter of self-defense, for even if the community does not command the deed, it is understood that it wants to be defended by any one of its own citizens, or even by a foreigner. If, therefore, it can only be defended by the death of the tyrant, it is lawful for any one to kill him. As soon as a king has been deposed, he ceases to be a legitimate king, and from that moment can claim no other title than that of tyrant, and as such may be killed by anyone. James Clement received with joy the mortal wounds that fell upon him when he struck the king, because at the price of his blood he was setting free his country. His murder was expiated by another murder, and so the manes of the Duke of Guise, who was iniquitously murdered, were expiated by an effusion of royal blood. James Clement performed a great, admirable, and memorable action, by which he taught the princes of the world that their impious enterprises cannot always remain unpunished. The same power is possessed by any private person who is brave enough to succor the commonwealth without regard to the peril of his own life. It would be an immense advantage to mankind if there were many persons among them who could thus disdain life and perform such valiant actions for the liberty of their native country. But the majority are held back by an inordinate desire of self-preservation, which incapacitates them for great deeds. The result is that tyrants have been as numerous as we all know, and that very few of them have died by the hands of their subjects. Nevertheless, it is well princes should know that, if they oppress their subjects and render themselves intolerable by their vices and impurities, they then live only by the deficiency in courage of those who have the right to slay them, not only justly, but gloriously and meritoriously. It is not to be doubted that a tyrant may be lawfully slain wherever one can have access to him, whether he be taken in his palace or deceived and drawn into an ambuscade outside it. It is certainly the most noble and magnanimous course to attack openly the enemy of the commonwealth,
but it is no less a commendable prudence to profit by any favorable occasion to deceive and surprise him, in order that the deed may produce less sensation and less danger to the community and to private persons." Unquote.
The terrible maxims thus preached by the Jesuits can only be considered as logical consequences of the fundamental principle of their institution, which recognizes in the Pope a temporal power paramount to all other civil powers, so that the latter ought to efface themselves or to exist only as secondary and subordinate. The institutions and the fundamental object of the company require its members not to acknowledge the civil power, except so far as it is useful to the Church and the company, for which reason the Jesuits, although residing in all countries, are not citizens of any, and do not consider themselves bound to obey the laws of nations unless they are compelled by positive force. They have accordingly studied to exempt themselves from the fulfillment of the laws, and have obtained privileges which are really singular. It is therefore by no means surprising that their policy and maxims should have alienated from them the sympathies of the public authorities, and this even in the countries most purely Roman Catholic. Thus the Jesuits, in accordance with their constitutions and prerogatives granted by them by the popes, consider themselves as independent of all civil power. On this ground, the Society has never presented its titles, laws, and privileges, with the papal bulls confirming them, to the government of any country in which it has been established to obtain a legal sanction. They recognize no other authority than the popes, and constituted governments are, by their account, bound not to authorize their existence, but simply to protect their privileges and prerogatives under pain of excommunication. Gregory XIV, in his bull of 1591, confirming the institution of the Jesuits, prohibited, at the request of General Acquaviva, all Christian authorities from in any way tampering with or curtailing such privileges of the religious orders as had been approved by the Holy See. Paul III had already granted the Jesuits the power of building and of acquiring lands in all parts of the world, in spite of any other power, secular or ecclesiastical, declaring that the company, its members, and its property belonged to the patrimony of St. Peter and the jurisdiction of the Apostolic See, for which reason, in whatever part of the world they may be, their persons and property are exempt from tithes, contributions, gables, donatives, collections, subsidies, etc., even for the defense of the country or for the other most urgent reasons. No king, prince, or community, no magistrate, military commander, or any other authority can presume to control them without incurring the guilt of rebellion against the Pope. Nor was it sufficient to emancipate the persons and property of the Society from all ordinary jurisdiction. It was necessary to create judges provided with peculiar powers to deal with them. The popes have therefore given the Jesuits the power in all countries of nominating their own judges under the name of conservators, who can try them without judicial formalities, and any civil and ecclesiastical powers opposing their free action are condemned, and their acts declared null and void. The pontifical bulls give these conservators plenary powers, even over temporalities and secular persons, for they are authorized to impose pecuniary penalties and to lay under an interdict the places that afford a refuge to the enemies of the Society. The bulls authorize the conservators to repress all secular and ecclesiastical powers, not exclusive of prelates or kings, that may molest the company and its possessions, privileges, or reputation, publicly or privately, directly or indirectly, in whatever manner it may be, or under whatever pretext. The Jesuits can constrain to appear before their judge conservators all classes of persons, lay and ecclesiastical, provided there be a question of any manifest injuries or violence done to the property or privileges of the company. Nor was it sufficient that the Society should name its own judge conservators. It received also the right of removing them at pleasure. In the earliest bulls obtained by the Jesuits for the establishment of these personages, it is merely said that they must pronounce a decision, but in the bull of 1571 it is added that they may take measures to execute it. Thus the institution is derogatory to the laws and sovereignty of states, for it establishes in them, without their cognizance, a class of judges whose proceedings are independent of judicial formalities and who constitute a veritable secret power. Besides all this, the popes, in virtue of their supposed temporal sovereignty over all Christendom, have authorized the company of Jesus to appoint scribes for all their affairs, giving the general of the order the right of converting the members into public functionaries, whose acts are to be received with perfect confidence in the courts of justice. The popes have, by their bulls, given the Jesuits a separate civil law with respect to their titles to real property, proroguing these for 60 years, even when already granted for a shorter term. They have, moreover, established a special form of proceedings for the concerns of the company, to which they subject the civil judges, and they have released the Jesuits from the observation of the laws of restitution whenever they may thereby suffer, even if it is through the fault of their superiors, a dispensation which makes all contracts with them illusory. The general alone has power to conduct operations and contracts, and those who make an agreement with him must do it according to the customs and privileges of the company, though there are articles in the declarations of the society which exempt it from the fulfillment of its engagements, the opposite parties being nevertheless bound thereby. One article says that the general, even if he grant permission to his inferiors to make contracts, yet reserves to himself the right of cancelling them for any good reason that may prevent itself. The laws and constitutions of the company take no more account of the episcopal jurisdiction or the rights of the parochial ministers or ordinary monastic orders than they do of the rights of the civil power. The bull issued by Paul III in 1549 declares the company and its members free and exempt from all superiority, jurisdiction, and correction of the ordinaries. No prelate can excommunicate a Jesuit, or suspend him, or place him under an interdict. The same privilege is extended to the external disciples, servants, and workmen of the company. The Jesuits who are elected by the general can preach in all parts, confess all believers, and absolve them from all sins, even in the cases reserved to the Pope. The bishops cannot prevent the Jesuits from administering the sacrament on any Sunday between Palm Sunday and the first Sunday after Easter, nor refuse them leave to exercise this function in their dioceses generally and indefinitely, without specifying time, place, and persons. No bishop, without an express authorization from the Pope, can lay under an interdict a house belonging to Jesuits, nor an individual Jesuit, nor oblige one to undergo a new examination unless some reason has supervened relative to his actual confession. The bishops cannot prevent the Jesuits from preaching in their churches. The believers who attend masses, sermons, or vespers in the churches of the society are credited therewith as if they had fulfilled their parochial duties. The generals of the company can create congregations of all kinds, grant and distribute indulgences to the same, give them statutes and alter the same as they please, without requiring the approbation of the Holy See, and their regulations will be respected, as if they had proceeded directly from the latter, nor have the bishops, according to the pontifical bulls, any right to visit these congregations, or to meddle with their administration, except in certain very peculiar cases. At page 28 of the Compendium of the Bulls and Privileges of the Company, we meet with one saying that such privileges as have been granted to it in contravention of the decrees of the Council of Trent shall subsist notwithstanding. And another prohibits the making or receiving any appeal from the company's ordinances and corrections. The colleges of the Jesuits are considered as universities, of which the superiors are authorized to grant degrees to externs as well as to Jesuits, comprising all the privileges of graduates in the universities. Every university or individual opposing them is to lose all rights and privileges, and to be cited before the conservators to be excommunicated. The students in the Jesuits' colleges are not to graduate in the universities, because they must not take the oaths there prescribed, and the magistrates must execute the prescriptions of the rectors of the colleges, and protect the persons whom they recommend to them. As if all these privileges had not been sufficient, the Jesuits obtained from Pope Pius V a bull declaring, quote, that all privileges, past, present, or future, obtained or to be obtained by other religious orders, and all prerogatives that may have been conceded to them, including those most specially noteworthy, all immunities, exemptions, faculties, concessions, privileges, graces, spiritual and temporal, that might have been granted, or might hereafter be granted, to any congregations, monasteries, chapters, or individuals of either sex, or their monasteries, houses, hospitals, and other places, should be also conceded ipso facto to the Jesuits without their needing any special concession, unquote. And the bull adds that it forbids the derogation of any of these privileges, and that if they were to be derogated, the general of the company might reestablish them by his own authority. The result of all that we have mentioned is that by the vow of passive obedience and by the organization of the society, the general is rendered absolute master of it,
and that by the institutions, bulls, and concessions of the popes, he is made more independent than kings are. But, in fact, this is only what he would be if the nations, renouncing their natural independence, were to submit blindly to the temporal power of the popes and receive their bulls as overruling the laws and rights of the state. What is there then to be surprised at in the antipathy which the company of Jesus has generally encountered when their institutions, laws, and privileges are a direct menace and affront to common rights, civil laws, the canons of the bishops and the parochial priests, the prerogatives of the universities and the religious orders, and, in short, to all political and religious societies together? Chapter 3. Papal censures and excommunications of the enemies of the company of Jesus, despotism of the generals of the order, enslavement of the members, obligation of the Jesuits to inform against one another, spiritual exercises. We have seen in the chapter just closed an epitome of the privileges granted by the Church of Rome to the company of Jesus. Let us now glance at the censures and excommunications which the popes have lavished around them to preserve the society and its privileges. Although evasive and nugatory in respect to common law, how many timorous and ignorant persons have these censures alarmed and troubled? The following are excommunicated, quote, all kings, princes, and administrators imposing contributions or burdens of any kind on the property or persons of the society, all who in any manner may injure the company of Jesus, all who forcibly oblige the society, its houses, or its churches to say Mass, to grant orders, to make processions, to convene assemblies, ecclesiastical or of any other class, to furnish garrisons, etc., all who dare to oppose the concessions granted to the company, who presume to accept illegitimately the office of judge conservator, or who, having accepted it, discharge its functions negligently, who violently attack the churches and houses of the company, all rectors of universities, etc., molesting the rectors and professors of the Jesuit colleges, all opposing the privileges of the Jesuits, their universities, degrees, etc., all who entertain and harbor Jesuits escaping from their houses without permission of the general, all detaining anything that belongs to the society, its members, houses, or churches, money or otherwise, unless they restore it within 3 days, all violating the asylum of the company, all parents using their natural rights over their children to prevent their entering the company, all members of the society appealing against the ordinances of their superior without the Pope's express permission, unquote. We have cited only a selection from these excommunications, and we shall now conclude with a fuller recital of one that is every year read in the houses and colleges of the Jesuits in the following terms, quote, excommunicated are all and each of the persons, secular or ecclesiastical, or whatever order, estate, degree, or preeminence, including bishops, archbishops, patriarchs, cardinals, and all discharging any civil trust or office whatsoever, who attack the company, its constitutions, decrees, or any other articles referring to them, even if it be under the pretext of discussion to seek the true good of the majority, and whether publicly or privately, directly or indirectly, and all who desire to change or alter or reform these, who attack the reputation of the Jesuits, unquote. Here, then, is a body of men in the midst of the human associations, which are imperfect, liable to modification, and in continual movement, itself declared perfect, immutable, inassailable, and invariable, exempt from burdens and tributes of all kinds, and with rights superior to those of the society in which it lives. Is this rational? Is it possible? We have seen excommunications launched against the great and small who oppose the Jesuits in the least points. We shall see now how they are freed, in all cases and under all circumstances, from the most general anathemas that the Church can launch.
They have the privilege of freely entering places laid under an interdict. No excommunications, suspensions, or interdicts published by the ordinaries or other authorities against the Jesuits, their houses, or persons can take effect without special permission from the Holy Father, in the absence of which they must be annulled. The Pope alone can excommunicate the Jesuits. Gregory XIV said in his bull of 1591, in conceding to the general of the Jesuits his immense prerogatives, that, quote, among other advantages which would ensue, the company, being organized like a monarchical government, would be, in respect of its sentiments, a perfect unity, and its members in all parts of the world, being bound to their chiefs by the bands of passive obedience, would be more promptly and easily ruled and led by the sovereign vicar of Jesus Christ on earth, to the different functions that he might assign them according to the special vow they have taken, unquote. However, the authority of the general is not only monarchical, as this pope says, but also despotic. Despotism and enslavement are correlative terms of which one explains the other. From a material point of view, it constitutes a slave to be without personal freedom and property. From a moral and intellectual point of view, to be a slave is to be deprived of freedom in one's judgments and conscience. Both these despotisms are combined in the company of Jesus. Its constitutions set the general in the place of Jesus Christ and God. There are in them hundreds of phrases similar to the following, quote, it is necessary everywhere to see Jesus Christ in the general, and his voice must be obeyed as if it were that of God himself. Whoever may be the superior, he must be regarded as Jesus Christ, unquote. The constitutions of almost all monastic orders contain hard maxims relative to obedience. It is said in the rule of St. Benedict that one must obey even in impossible things, and in the rule of the Carthusians that the will must be immolated as a sheep might be. The constitutions of St. Basil decide that monks must be in the hands of their superiors as the wedge in that of the carpenter. In the rules of St. Bernard, it is averred that obedience is a blessed taper, which lightens the soul on the way of salvation. St. John Climacus says that obedience is the tomb of the will, and Bonaventura that the truly obedient man is like a corpse, which allows itself to be removed and carried about without resistance. The constitutions of the barefooted Carmelite nuns lay down that the orders of a superior must be executed, as if not to execute them, or to do so with reluctance, were an act of mortal sin. These maxims the Jesuits have brought together from many quarters in their own institutions, and converted into positive rules and vows of perpetual obligation. Is it possible to calculate how far a man may go when, like the general of the Jesuits, he can not only command the whole society, but has, by its organization and the charges committed to him during life, been enabled to penetrate the conscience of each member and to master his most secret thoughts? It is not surprising that some popes should have endeavored to make the generalship of the Jesuits triennial instead of perpetual. But the project has been unfulfilled. In all other monastic orders, there are assemblies and chapters which meet regularly and impose some kind of restriction on the proceedings of their heads, but nothing of the kind exists among the Jesuits, who never meet except when their general dies, and then only to elect another. As the society reserves to itself the right of not fulfilling a contract when it thinks this would be prejudicial to it, so it claims the right of expelling its members, notwithstanding that the latter cannot withdraw from it of their own will without liability to be excommunicated and treated as apostates. The novices may retire until they have taken their first vows, but if they have taken all the vows and have been raised even to the highest dignities, they may yet be expelled by the general without his assigning any reason, or consulting any arbiter, nor need he return anything to them, though they may have brought considerable funds into the society. Thus this slavery is harder than any other, inasmuch as a master is commonly bound to maintain his slave, and the general's power of expelling members, per causas secretas, proves to what a degree injustice is predominant in these institutions, and mystery affected on all occasions, since the natural course would not be to expel any member without a trial. But here despotism is such a rooted principle that the members have no rights and count for nothing. Despotism thrives by delation and inquisition. Its arms are secret, and its servants can be nothing but spies and informers, while themselves liable to the scrutiny and informations of others like them. The despot must know the character, talents, and capacities of his subjects in order to derive the greatest possible utility from them by judicious employment. He must also foster distrust among them in order that they may trust him alone, and that his power may be the only one to make itself felt. In slavery, everything must be low and vile, for it admits of no elevation of the soul, nor spontaneity in the mind. No laudable project can spring up in an enslaved mind, nor is it possible that men degraded by servility, espionage, and delation, through a scrutiny which threatens and operates incessantly, should ever rise to great conceptions. If nature has given them strength, their education will yet deprive them of courage. The slave has no country. He has renounced his parents and forgotten the hearth of his family. He sees only the greatness of the master whom he serves, and of the empire which weighs him down. His eyes wait forever on his master, and he has no spontaneous activity, but only that infused by the power which he obeys. In Articles 9 and 10, Title 2, page 70, we find that every Jesuit must be glad that his faults and defects, and whatever can be observed about him, should be revealed to his superiors by the first observer of it, and that all must watch and inform against one another. These belong to what are called the essential articles of the institution. In the 4th chapter of the examination of those desirous to join the company, they are warned that they abandon all right to defend their honor, and owe the sacrifice of it to their superiors for the good of their souls and God's glory. In Article 5, it is stated that delations are obligatory. It is impossible that hypocrisy should not be the principal result of a system like this. It is considered within the company a great sin to cherish the slightest scruple regarding the privileges of the institution, as if this would be doubting the legitimacy of the vow and the authority of the Pope, the society, and its founders. It is not only during their novitiate, but even after professing, that the Jesuits practice the spiritual exercises. Imagine, reader, a young man shut up in a still, lonely room, and without books, so that nothing may distract his thoughts, and thus abandoned to meditations of this sort. He must imagine 2 standards and 2 leaders, Jesus Christ and Satan, Jesus Christ in an agreeable form, standing on a well-chosen site, and reviewing his disciples, who are drawn up like soldiers, and Satan with a repulsive aspect, gathering his troops from all parts of the world. In meditating on hell, he must see a blazing flame, and souls burning in bodies of fire. He must hear shrieks and blasphemies, and imagine that through the nostrils and palate he experiences all manner of repulsive sensations. Each novice is warned to go through one meditation of this kind during the night, one in the morning, and one again after hearing Mass, and that his mind should be excited to such a degree that he may seem really to see and feel the objects he imagines. These exercises may be called a method of seeing visions, and to recommend them to young men and women as ordinary means of perfecting themselves is to inoculate their souls with fanaticism.